Aurelio Medina wrote the letter on a Tuesday in March, 2 months before he died. He wrote it by lamplight, slowly, with the particular care of a man who knows he will not have another chance to say the thing correctly. When he was finished, he folded it 4 times, sealed it inside an envelope, and hid it in the one place he was certain his brothers would never think to look. Welcome to Historias Entre Vidas. His wife was asleep in the next room. Their daughter, 7 years old and sick with the fever that had come and would not leave, was asleep beside her mother. Aurelio sat at the table for a long time after sealing the envelope, listening to the breathing in the other room, his wife steady and his daughter shallow. And then he blew out the lamp and went to bed, and he did not speak of the letter again. He died in May, of the same illness that had taken his father before him, the kind that moves slowly and then all at once. He left behind a wife named Soledad, a daughter named Luz, the small house in Cosamaloapan, Veracruz, where they had lived for 9 years, and, registered in his name at the notary office in the municipio, a wooden ranch on a hill road 40 minutes from town that had belonged to his grandfather, and that his brothers had always believed would one day be theirs. It was not theirs. It was Soledad's. And the letter would explain why. But Soledad did not know about the letter yet. She did not know about a great deal of things yet. What she knew in those first weeks after the burial was that her daughter's fever had not fully broken, that the savings Aurelio had left were not enough for both the doctor and the rent, and that her brothers-in-law, 3 men named Bernal, Ignacio, and the youngest, Toms, had begun to come around the house with the particular frequency of people assessing what they intend to take. Bernal came first, alone, on the 8th day. He said he was coming to see how they were managing. He sat in Aurelio's chair without asking. He drank the coffee Soledad offered because to refuse would have been too obvious, and over the coffee he said, in the voice of a man delivering a generosity, that the ranch in the hills, the old Medina ranch, the one that had been in the family since their grandfather's time, would of course remain in the family, that it was not a burden Soledad should have to think about, that he and his brothers would take care of the paperwork. Soledad looked at him across the table. "The ranch is in Aurelio's name," she said. "Yes," said Bernal. "And Aurelio is gone. These things have a process." She did not sign anything that day, but she understood what the visits meant. On the 12th day, Ignacio came with a document. On the 15th, Toms came alone and said nothing about the ranch at all, which was the version that frightened her most. On the 17th day, the notary's office sent a letter confirming that, as Aurelio's surviving spouse, Soledad had the right to all registered property unless a contesting claim was filed within 60 days. 60 days. She packed what she could carry. Luz bundled in the old rebozo that had been her own mother's, the framed photograph of Aurelio from the shelf above the stove, the few medicines the doctor had prescribed, and she went to the ranch on the hill road, not because she knew what she would find there, because she needed somewhere the 3 brothers were not. The ranch was wooden, which surprised her. She had imagined adobe, the way most things were built in the region. But Aurelio's grandfather had been a man who trusted wood, and he had built in pine and cedar from the Sierra, and the walls of the house had a warmth to them that adobe does not have, a warmth that came not from temperature, but from something older, something in the grain of the wood itself. The porch ran the length of the front. A ceiba tree grew at the edge of the yard, enormous and old, its roots lifting the earth around its base in slow, patient waves. Soledad stood in the yard with Luz on her hip and looked at the house. The roof needed work. The fence was mostly down. The weeds had come up through the yard so thoroughly that the path to the door was a suggestion rather than a fact. But it was standing. After everything, it was standing. She did not know yet that in the space beneath the floorboards of the back room, the room Aurelio's grandfather had used as a study, her husband had placed an envelope 2 months before his death, in a tin box sealed with wax, beside the spare key to a padlock that had not been used in 20 years. She did not know. But she would find it, and when she did, everything the brothers had said about what was theirs and what was not was going to come apart at the seams. The first person to come was not a neighbor. It was the horse. She appeared at the broken fence on the second morning, a gray mare, old, with a coat the color of morning fog, and the patient expression of an animal that has been somewhere long enough to have opinions about it. She stood at the gap in the fence and looked at Soledad with large dark eyes, and did not move away when Soledad approached. There was no brand on her and no rope, and she was thin but not desperately so, and her hooves needed attention, but her eyes were clear. "Where did you come from?" Soledad asked. The mare said nothing, in the manner of horses. Soledad brought her a handful of the dry grass from the yard, and the mare ate it from her palm with a delicacy that seemed, under the circumstances, like a form of courtesy. Luz, watching from the porch steps, said, "She has fog in her coat, Mom. She does," Soledad said. "Her name should be Niebla." And so the mare was named Niebla, and she stayed. No one came to claim her. She moved into the broken-down corral at the side of the house, as though she had always lived there, and in the mornings when Soledad came out to the porch with coffee, she would find Niebla standing at the corral fence looking toward the ceiba tree with the philosophical tranquility of a creature that has made its peace with uncertainty. People came slowly, the way people come to a place that has been empty, cautiously, to see if it is what it was before and whether it will hold. A woman from the road below, Doa Perpetua, appeared on the 4th day with a pot of black beans and a sack of tortillas, and the explanation that she had known Aurelio's grandfather and had been wondering when someone would come back to the ranch. She stayed 3 hours. She told Soledad where the well was and which boards on the porch were soft, and where the tool shed was, behind the ceiba, which Soledad had not yet found. In the tool shed there was a rusted machete, a coil of wire, an old wooden chair with one leg repaired with rope, and a coffee tin full of bolts and nails that had been sorted by size, which told Soledad more about Aurelio's grandfather than any story could have. Doa Perpetua came back the next day, and the day after that. She brought different things each time, once a bunch of herbs tied with string, once a jar of honey, once simply herself with her hands free and her sleeves rolled up, and the silent offer of 2 hours of work, which Soledad accepted without ceremony. They swept the main room together, mended the worst gaps in the porch railing, hauled water from the well in the old tin buckets that had been left in the shed. They worked mostly without talking, the way women work when they are past the stage of needing to explain themselves to each other. The morning ritual settled on its own, the way those things do. Soledad rose before the light changed, put water on the stove for coffee, and by the time it was ready she was on the porch with the cup warm in both hands, watching the pasture come into view as the dark lifted. Niebla would already be at the corral fence at that hour, looking out at the morning, and Soledad would carry a handful of dry grass from the pile beside the shed, and Niebla would eat it from her palm, carefully, as she had done on the very first day, and for those few minutes nothing was required of either of them except presence. Luz came out some mornings to stand beside her mother and watch. Her face had color in it that Soledad was careful not to make too much of in case she frightened it away. She was eating. She was sleeping through the night, which she had not been doing for months. The doctor in town said the hill air helped. Doa Perpetua said the ceiba tree helped. that old trees like that one held a particular stillness that the body recognized and rested into, which was not something Soledad could verify, but which she was not prepared to argue with. On the 6th day, a young man from the ejido up the road offered to fix the worst section of fence in exchange for nothing, because he said his father had grazed cattle on the Medina land years ago and owed a debt that had never been settled. Soledad said the debt was settled the moment he asked. He fixed the fence anyway. 3 sections of it. He came back 2 days later and fixed a 4th. On the 8th day, a Sunday, the priest from the chapel in the nearest settlement came by on his circuit and stopped to say a brief prayer over the house and the yard, as was the custom when someone new arrived. He was an old man, unhurried, with the particular calm of someone who has spent 50 years practicing not rushing the important things. He looked at Niebla in the corral and said she was a good horse, and he looked at Luz sitting on the porch step in the morning sun and said she had color in her face that he was glad to see, and then he said a prayer that was short and direct and entirely without performance, and left. Soledad stood in the yard after he left and felt something she had not felt in many weeks, which was the sense that she was not entirely alone in this. She was still not sleeping well. The nights were the hardest, Luz's breathing in the dark, the unfamiliar sounds of the old wooden house settling, the particular silence of a place that does not know you yet. Some nights she lay awake and talked to Aurelio in her head, the way she had done when he was alive, and she could not sleep. She told him about the horse, about Doa Perpetua's beans, about the young man from the ejido, about the ceiba tree and how large it was, and how its roots looked like hands pressing into the earth. She told him she was angry some nights. She told him she was more frightened than she let Luz see. She told him she needed him to have been right about this place. It was on the 11th night, when she could not sleep and rose to sit in the old chair on the porch, that Niebla moved in the corral and Soledad went to check on her, and crouched to look at the mare's left foreleg where she had been favoring it, and in crouching noticed that the light from the porch lamp fell at an angle through the back room window and lit the floor in a way that showed, faintly, the seam of a trapdoor she had not seen before. She had not been in the back room much. It was small and had no furniture, and she had been using the main room for everything. She went inside. She pressed along the seam with her fingers. The trapdoor lifted. And then she saw something that made her let go of the lamp, set it down fast, before it fell, and reach into the dark space beneath the floor with both hands. The tin box was there, sealed with old wax, exactly as Aurelio had left it. The key beside it fit the padlock, which she had not noticed until this moment was threaded through the tin's hasp. She opened it at the kitchen table in the lamplight with Luz asleep in the next room, and inside, folded 4 times and still sealed, was an envelope in her husband's handwriting. Her name was on the front. Only her name, as if he had always known it would find her. She opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. He had written it in March, 2 months before he died, by lamplight, slowly. He explained that he had known for some time that the illness was serious, that he had not told her because he could not bear to change the shape of the months they had left. He explained that the ranch had been left to him alone by his grandfather's will, specifically because his grandfather had seen something in Aurelio's brothers that he did not trust, and had worded the bequest accordingly, with a clause stating that the property could only pass to Aurelio's direct descendants or his spouse, and could not be transferred to his siblings under any circumstance. He explained that he had made copies of this clause and left one with the notary and one in the tin box, folded beneath the letter. He had known the brothers would come. He had known they would say the ranch was the family's, by tradition if not by law, and he had known that tradition, in the hands of men like his brothers, has a way of overriding law when no one is paying close attention. He had known Soledad would need the document. He had put it where she would find it when she needed it, in the place he was most certain she would go, not because he knew she would end up at the ranch exactly, but because he knew her. He knew that when the pressure became great enough, Soledad would go toward the thing that had been his, not away from it. She read the letter through once. She held it for a long time. Then she read it again. What she felt was not simple. It was not just grief or gratitude or relief, though it was all of those. It was the feeling of being known, of being seen, in advance, by someone who loved her carefully enough to think ahead, of being trusted with something he could not deliver himself. She folded the letter back along its 4 creases and put it in the pocket of her rebozo. She did not sleep that night. But it was a different kind of waking. The notary received the clause document the next morning. He read it, compared it to the file he already held, confirmed they matched, and told Soledad that the property was hers without contest and that any claim the brothers filed would fail on the face of it. The 60-day window had 22 days remaining. He advised her to let him handle the notification to the brothers directly, in writing, in the formal way that closes a door, without drama. She agreed. She thanked him. She drove back up the hill road. Bernal came to the ranch 4 days after the notary's letter reached him. He came alone this time, which Soledad noticed. He walked up to the porch while she was shelling beans at the porch table and stood at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hands, not in humility, she knew, but in the performance of it, the version a man puts on when he has calculated that it will be more effective than force. He said the notary's letter had been a surprise. He said the family had simply not known about the clause, and that ignorance was not the same as bad faith. He said Aurelio would have wanted the land to remain within the Medina family in some form. He said that a woman alone, managing a ranch like this, with a sick child, and here his eyes moved to Luz, who was sitting on the porch step behind Soledad, surely had to see the practical wisdom of an arrangement that gave her financial stability without the burden of the land itself. He said it all carefully, the way he had said things his whole life, dressed in reason, in concern, in the language of people who believe they are being generous when they are being greedy. Soledad set down the beans. She looked at Bernal for a long moment. Behind her, she could hear Niebla moving in the corral, that familiar sound, the soft percussion of the mare's steps on the dry earth. Aurelio left me this ranch, she said. He left it to me because he wanted me to have it. He wrote that down and had it witnessed and put it in the hands of a notary, and he also wrote it in a letter he hid in the floor of this house, where he knew I would find it when I needed it most. She paused. That is not a man who wanted the land to go back to his brothers. That is a man who knew his brothers and made his wishes plain anyway. Bernal's jaw tightened. Soledad, the notary has the documents. If you have a legal claim, make it to him. She picked the beans back up. Luz and I are fine. Thank you for asking. Bernal stood at the bottom of the porch steps a moment longer. He turned the hat in his hands once, twice, then he put it back on his head, nodded once in the way of a man who has not admitted defeat but has recognized the door is closed, and walked back to his truck. Doa Perpetua, who had been inside the house and had heard everything through the open window, came out when the truck was gone and sat down at the porch table across from Soledad and poured herself a coffee from the pot that was sitting there. He won't come back, she said. No, Soledad said. He won't. They shelled beans together in the late afternoon light, and neither of them said anything more about it, and the matter was finished. 2 weeks later, Bernal sent a letter that said nothing about the ranch and asked how Luz was doing. It was the first time any of the three had asked. Soledad wrote back, briefly, that Luz was better, which was true. The fever had not fully returned since the first week at the ranch, and the doctor in town said the hill air and the steady meals and the sleep were doing what the medicines alone had not. Toms called once on the telephone at the notary's office, where Soledad checked in weekly. She was not there when he called. She did not call back. Ignacio she did not hear from at all. That was the end of it. Not a confrontation, not a scene. Just a door that closed, legally, firmly, and without noise, the way Aurelio had always preferred things to close. When the dry season softened into the long green months of Veracruz's wet summer, the old Medina ranch became something it had not been in years. A working place. Soledad planted beans along the south fence and corn in the cleared ground behind the ceiba. Niebla grew fat on the new grass and stopped favoring her left leg, and in the evenings she and 2 goats that Doa Perpetua had brought. Because a corral with only a horse is a sad corral, Doa Perpetua had said, came in from the pasture together at the same hour every night, unhurried, as though they had appointments to keep and were simply keeping them. Luz grew. The fever did not come back. One evening near the end of the rainy season, Soledad was sitting on the porch with Aurelio's letter in her lap. She had taken to reading it sometimes, not for the information, which she had memorized, but for the handwriting, for the sound of him in the sentences. When Luz came out and sat beside her on the step and asked what she was reading. "A letter from your father," Soledad said. Luz was quiet for a moment. The animals were coming in across the darkening pasture, Niebla's gray coat going silver in the last light. "What does it say?" Luz asked. Soledad looked at the letter. She looked at the pasture. She looked at the ceiba tree with its great roots and its patience. "It says he knew us," she said. "It says he thought ahead." Luz leaned against her mother's arm. Neither of them said anything more. The goats reached the corral and went in. Niebla stopped at the fence and turned to look back at the pasture once, the way she always did, as though checking that nothing was left behind, and then she went in too. Sometimes God places the exact people and the exact moments in our path not to carry us, but to show us that we were already carrying more than we knew. Aurelio Medina could not stay. But he left behind something that no brother could contest and no lawyer could dissolve, the knowledge, written in his own hand, that he had seen his wife clearly and trusted what he saw. And Soledad Medina learned, in a wooden house on a hill in Veracruz, that the strongest promises are not always spoken. Sometimes they are folded 4 times and hidden in the dark until the person who needs them most finds the courage to lift the floor. Who appeared in your life when no one else was looking? If this story reached something in your heart, leave your comment below. I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Give this story a like, subscribe to Historias Entre Vidas, and ring the bell so you never miss one. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the people who love us carefully leave something behind, even when they go. Until the next story. Niebla was still at the fence the next morning when Soledad came out with her coffee, looking toward the pasture with those large dark eyes, exactly as she had looked on the very first day. As though the world beyond the fence was something worth watching, as though she had always known this place was worth staying for.